Sennheiser made a pair of closed-back HD800s, the HD820. But did they succeed? Well, let's find out. I remember back in 2009, I bought one of the first pairs of Sennheiser's HD800 headphones from the now defunct Headroom. I think it was serial number 525 or 535, I forget which, but if you have one of those, you probably have my old headphones. And I remember plugging them into, I think it was Audio GD's first balanced headphone amp, the Phoenix, and it was a very nice combination of the smoother solid state sound with the very wide soundstage of the HD800s. But of course, one of the first things I noticed is how kind of bright the headphones were. They didn't have as much perceived bass, but they did have this massive soundstage, which was glorious in many respects and a really great mid-range. Now, it's interesting that I also then later reviewed the HD800S, which I was the first person to announce the presence of on YouTube. Now we also have the Sennheiser HD8XX and now the HD820. The HD820 is interesting because, of course, that it's a pair of closed-back HD800Ss. It's not just so simple that some people have said, oh, they just slapped a glass cover on the back of the headphones. It's not that simple at all. To change a pair of headphones from an open back to closed back requires a lot of engineering effort. If you consider, say, for example, Dan Clark Audio and the Stealth that's sitting behind me, that was supposed to be a closed back pair of Ether 2s. But in the end, the difficulties of making it closed back resulted in them redesigning the entire headphones completely from scratch, maintaining only the headband. And much the same thing has happened with Sennheiser, as this is still the original headband from the HD800. So nothing has changed as far as I know in that design since 2009. It's still a little bit odd in that regard, in that if you put it on its most tightest setting, it looks like it will only fit, well, a baby. I mean, it was not going to fit anyone's head at that kind of position, except maybe a small child. But also it has some positives and negatives as far as the fit goes with closed back headphones, because critical to these headphones and the Stealths, which I will talk about in their own review, seal is critical. That is how well the headphones seal on your ears. Now for me, I found that I had to actually fit them tighter than I normally would, push these further up in my head, which is kind of very average, to get a better seal. So I'd end up with my ears closer to the bottom of the cups than I would otherwise have, say, a pair of HD800S or the normal original HD800. To have them further down, sometimes I got a little bit of a break somewhere around my eyes or somewhere around my head. Also, the headband has a spring in the top which aims to push the cups into a slightly tilted forward position, and this was great with the HD800, especially. This is a pair of HD8XX, because you wanted the drivers, which are already tilted forward, to be a little bit more speaker-like in that they're sitting forward of your ears. But with something where you want to maintain seal, that didn't work out quite so well. But on the connection to the cups themselves are the same as always, a very stiff hinge. I talked quite extensively to the successor of the designer of these headphones. Now, the designer, as you may know, was Axel Grell, a very famous designer at Sennheiser, who left Sennheiser fairly recently. His successor, I asked many questions about the HD820s and the design, and we talked about the difficulties of making a pair of closed-back headphones. One of the things I did is that annoying kind of audiophile non-engineer enthusiast thing is, and I told him how I think they should have been designed. And I said I'm going to do that I'm not an engineer thing and say, well, I wish they'd had that kind of stiff hinge that's on the cups on the headband yoke as well, so that you could get a better position for the seal. But being that they used the original headband from the HD800s, they were stuck with that. I've seen people say they tried a pair of HD820s at, say, a show or meet, and they sounded terrible. And my impression was from people who have owned pairs and the like, that you need to ensure that they seal well. Now, of course, the glass back has always been something that's talked well about. I won't go into super detail on that, but it's designed, of course, when you have a driver for a pair of headphones on your head, what's going to happen is sound is not only going towards your ear, but is also going backwards. Now, if you have something like a pair of HiFiMan headphones where this is most noticeable, if you put your hands even somewhere far out from your head, you will start to get sound bouncing off your hands from the driver and bouncing back, and you'll find that the sound of the music changes with your hand even somewhat fairly far out. And this is the consequence of having extremely light drivers, which are extremely sensitive to this. So imagine having something right close up to the driver that you have to compensate for that back wave with, and things start to get very complex. And that's why they have this concave piece of glass which deflects those sounds out into parts of the cups where they will not have any influence, or they can put other materials or control the damping and how the sound moves around in there to maintain that really large sound stage that the HD800 series are famous for. But aside from that and the deeper cups, we also have these more plush ear pads. So if you look at a pair of the HD8XX here, you have the thin ear pads on here, but with thicker ear pads, maybe there's a chance for a better seal and also maybe a slightly deeper chamber. But there are also some internal changes in the arrangement of the cups. It's not just simply the original cup design with covers slapped on by any means. It has obviously been very carefully engineered to maintain both the large soundstage of the HD800 series, but produce very high quality sound at the same time. Now as well, lastly, we have the cable. Now this is an aftermarket Kimber cable I just happen to have on at the moment. If you are very triggered by cables, you're probably going to find some of the discussion in this video annoying, but I'd like to give some background about my experience with the HD800s to give a better understanding of my review. HD800s had the interesting issue. They had a treble peak at around 6.3 kilohertz. Now, if you've seen my other videos, you'll know something about this. Headphone design, because of the way your ears are, it means that a pair of, say, headphones that are completely flat tuned will just not work. Our ears are less sensitive, of course, to sounds in, say, around the 2 to 3 kilohertz range. So you'll see a bump in uncompensated graphs of measurements of headphones. Likewise, you'll see a peak around usually 8 to 10 kilohertz, and that's because all of our hearing has a null, that is a point where it cancels out those particular frequencies. So you might have a null at 8 kilohertz, I might have a null at 9 kilohertz or something like that. Now, if the peak of the headphones matches the null in your hearing, the headphones will sound darker to you than they will to other people. So if you imagine a null is the equivalent of, that old trick where you close one eye, hold a finger out, and while looking straight ahead, you move that finger out to the side, and you'll see there's a point where it kind of disappears, because that point is directly opposite the optic nerve and where there are no cells to pick up the light signals. That's similar to what a null in your hearing is, a point in the frequency range that is just cancelled out. But at 6.3 kilohertz, I don't think anyone has a null there. And I remember one of the first things I encountered was Cowboy Junkie's Sweet Jane, or as with the HD800s, it was Sweet Jane. And that kind of brightness was kind of grating for a flagship pair of headphones at the time. And that, of course, at the time where a pair of $1,500 headphones were considered incredibly expensive. Of course, nowadays that's probably over $2,000 in today's money, so we had to allow for that. Nowadays, of course, we have $3,000 to $4,000 headphones are kind of the norm, so it doesn't seem so expensive in comparison. And of course, at $2,000, well, they're not going for the super high-end flagship kind of status, although they do consider this the best headphones they've ever made. Around that time, I also started experimenting with aftermarket cables. There weren't any connectors for the HD800 available at the time, so eventually I got hold of a pair of connectors and actually DIY'd my own cable using some nice copper wire, and I found that I liked the slightly more mellow sound as a result. Now, the thing I discovered playing around with aftermarket cables is I didn't like the stock cable. It wasn't a particular thing that one aftermarket cable was better or worse to a huge degree than another. It was more that just the stock cable seemed to exacerbate that kind of treble energy around the 6.3 kilohertz mark, which made, well, if you were listening to classical, it was fantastic, but if you were listening to, say, again, Sweet Jane, it was not so pleasant. But the interesting thing is now, with my system as it is, even with stuff like the Chord Hugo TT2, which is considered a kind of, some people consider brighter, but I would consider, say, extremely low distortion headphone amplifier, I haven't found the stock cable to be perfectly fine with that, although I did play around with things like the Kimber cable and things from Norn and Moon Audio and that kind. And likewise, I also have the Studio 6 tube amp here. I could listen to a sound that was slightly more mellow than, say, plugging everything directly into the TT2. But overall, it didn't change my impressions of the headphones. So there is some kind of subtle tunability that in the kind of audiophile world that we like to do that can be done with the HD820s, and I'd still probably prefer to go for the warmer overall setup than the direct from the cord with a stock cable setup for preference. So I'm not going to go much into any more detail about kind of the fine tuning of that. That's kind of up to the individual and what you prefer. but I'm going to talk about how the headphones sound with a variety of music. So, after the break, let's get into my sound impressions. Before we start, this review is sponsored by Headamp.com, makers of the legendary Blue Hawaii electrostatic headphone amplifier, as well as the Gilmore series of headphone amplifiers. They also sell the Sennheiser HD820, as well as some of the other products you see in this review. One of my first impressions once I managed to get a good seal is that they sounded very bright like the HD800 series does, but at the same time where I kind of thought that the HD800 didn't have, say, vocals and instruments quite so far forward, maybe a little bit recessed, and sometimes I wanted the greater intimacy of, say, plainer headphones. On the other hand, with the HD820s, I actually found the mid-range to be more forward than expected. What, of course, I noticed was that the bass tended to be not quite as strong as I liked. And back to talking about position of cups on my head, I generally wanted the sound to be a little more how it felt when I pushed the cups slightly in and the bass was elevated slightly. But doing so tend to elevate the low bass and tend to make it sound a little bit disjointed. So I think they did actually hit the ideal that they could with this design. Although I do wish again that the springs in these cups were replaced with a stiff hinge like on the back of the yokes directly into the cups, as that would have helped with being able to position them to get a better seal well, because they do sit quite far. They do, if I sit them right behind my ears, they are coming right forward almost as just up to where the bones are next to my eyes. So you are looking like covering a large area of your head. So depending on the kind of shape of your head, you may have trouble getting a seal. And of course, like as I said before, at meets, I think this is where people had trouble getting a seal and the headphones didn't sound so great. So let's glance over at some of my music impressions. I was listening to Hostile's Cradle to the Grave, and the deep rumble of that comes through with really good quality, which of course the large driver in the Sennheiser HD800 series has always been very good with, but not in a great deal of quantity. And that's again where I wanted a little bit of a tighter seal to get a bit more bass in there. Likewise, Jimi Hendrix, Born Under a Bad Sign. The guitar was actually more forward than expected with such a large pair of headphones, and the imaging feels spot on, kind of riding nicely between presenting instruments and creating space around them. What really felt missing was a rumble of the bass guitar. Experimenting had me feeling that it's slightly an ergonomics issue, with maybe slightly better results from coming to pushing, again, in at the top of the very cups. Things like Sophie Tucker, Deja Vu Affair, again, punchy but slightly woolly bass compared to other high-end flagships that I have, which are, of course, way more expensive. And the mid-range carries through the HD800 tradition of being kind of very great and very precise with vocals, even with the Kimber cable on here, and the treble is still slightly edgy and doesn't have the delicate touch that you can get, again, with things like the Stealth and some of the other high-end headphones here. Now, music along those lines, say Thievery Corporation, and that more analytical nature of the HD820 combined with the larger soundstage result in a kind of somewhat more disconnected feeling for the music than you get, say, with high-end planers where there's more bass and more thump. Though it could be argued the bass from the HD820 is kind of tight. But onto something more vocal and direct instrument based, Harry Manx, Rubens Train, which is a lovely track. And again, Harry Manx's music is an experience in itself. Much as it did with Thievery Corporation, I didn't feel as connected with the music as I did have listening with other headphones. And that's one of the consequences I feel with the HD800 series, is that it creates sometimes too much space and sometimes you want more intimacy. Now, listening to Radiohead's House of Cards, that kind of slightly brighter presentation became more fatiguing, even with the compensation of having the Kimber cable and the tube amp in there. Although it's not super warm, it didn't really take away that slightly fatiguing sound of the brighter treble. Now, compared to something like HiFiMan's Aryas, which are very popular headphones and were the kind of what I call the black HD1000s I always wanted, while the Arya doesn't sound as wide as the HD820, actually I think nothing really does, it does sound somewhat more like the HD820 does if you push the cups in closer to your ears, giving you a kind of more squashed or a bit more intimate sound. However, it does have that sound that I wish was a touch warmer sometimes. Now, I also got a chance to try it via the other closed-back headphones I have here, the Dan Clark Audio Stealth. Now, the Stealth are, well, you have to see in their own review. They're taking me quite a while to get a real solid handle on how best to describe them. But both headphones have similar issues where I wish they had a bit of a firmer seal. And again, Dan Clark Audio used much the same kind of headband system as he used in his other headphones. And that sometimes to me didn't push things in quite so well. And the Stealth also has the issue that you can even move your jaw slightly and break the seal, which can be sometimes a little bit irritating. Now, the Stealth has a slightly more muted treble, but in a very sharp mid-range like the HD820. And the bass rumble seems more reserved. That's because of the very, very heavy damping and the cancellation out of distortions inside the cups. And this results in even tighter and somewhat more seemingly more reserved bass, even though they measure like as having a higher bass amount. Now the Stealth sounds more closed in the HD820, which is not a surprise at all. Again, the HD820 is what makes everything sound wide, really wide. Now, if I listen to, say, the Stealth on its own, I don't notice, it doesn't feel closed in. That's what happens when you switch between headphones. If you go to Stealth to HD820, the HD820 sounds really wide. If you go HD820 to Stealth, the Stealth sounds more closed in. It's a comparison thing and something you don't notice so much if you're just listening to the headphones on their own. Now, the LCD-5 with Patricia Barber's This Town on her very latest album, the LCD-5 is definitely way more intimate, although it manages to maintain image clarity. Now, if you saw my review of those, it has a very kind of spherical sound stage, which, well, once you get used to it, is very good, but it does have maybe a mid-range that, to me, was a touch too mid-forward. The mid-range is darker than both the HD820 and the Stealth, so it seems to be stronger in the lower mids than I would normally expect with most headphones. But I felt that the piano had slightly better timbre with the LCD-5s. I also listened to Lucinda Williams' Are You Down, the album version. Now, voices are lighter with the HD820. It seems to be that mid-range is lighter and brighter with the HD820s than, say, the LCD-5s. And the stronger treble gives the guitar and vocals more bite, despite the wider soundstage. Now, the Stealth, in comparison, takes the edge off the treble and mid-range slightly, damping the bite slightly in the process. Likewise, the sound is more in your head than with the HD820, and this is not something that is so apparent using the Stealth by itself. And in comparison, the final D8000 Pros sound warmer, with the vocals and instruments pushed back more in the process, sounding a bit wider, but softer. Now, something which is a little bit more modern, say Eels, the deconstruction. There is a good thump from the D8000 Pro, but this is completely lost with the HD820, the bass being light and quite reserved. The Stealth likewise delivers this with an intense mid-range and very tight if present bass. It doesn't come through with a thump of the D8000 Pro again, and however, nor the Meze Elite, which of course has a very warm sound signature as well. So going from kind of warmer to lighter, you end up with something like the Meze Empyrean, and then the Meze Elite, and then there's, say, the D8000s and D8000 Pro, which goes towards what I call listening neutral, which is probably technically slightly V-shaped, and then technically flat with something like the Audeze LCD-5, or maybe high-end speaker listening flat with the Stealth. And then you have the HD820, which does have this very kind of present mid-range, but super wide soundstage and very kind of bright sound signature, with a bass that seems maybe reserved and maybe too reserved for preference, unless you want to kind of feel like you're so far back from something that you can't feel the bass. Now, for other music impressions, I'm going to write up a whole lot of these for my written review of this, so if you want to see my other music impressions, please do check that out on here.audio. But one more I will do is Fleetwood Mac's Dreams, which is, well, everyone knows that track. Now, the Stealth enters with a good reserved bass, for example, sounding like speakers in a highly damped room as expected. Now, the HD820's bass, which varies from kind of a bit light to boomy with slight pressure on the cups, I still feel like it has a slightly, well, sharp treble, slightly not as clean as, say, if you've listened with like electrostats, or again, something like the Stealth, something which has a very high quality and can do a very delicate treble. And again, this is probably why the original series stock cable always bugged me, because it made that kind of more emphasized. It feels as if I want more bass, but a very slight adjustment of the mid-range treble balance. But again, drums lack a solid thump that make you feel them more. So the thing is that, say, the LCD-5 lays on the sound thicker, and I'd probably say that in my evaluation now, timbre, the LCD-5 may just win out over all the headphones, maybe in competition with the Stealths. But that's something I'm going to talk about in the review of the Stealths, I think. Now, of course, in comparison, if you listen to the LCD-5s after the HD820, they sound kind of thicker and maybe a little bit more congested, because everything's in that tighter sphere around your head, whereas the HD820s make everything sound more wide and open. In comparison, the D8000 Pro tends to be like three blobs. You have this center, and then you have everything very left and right. But it does make for very more easy listening with that kind of warmer bass and slightly more relaxed, but still slightly bright treble. Now, of course, after listening with the HD820s, listening to Meze's Elite, the Elite sounds very thick and warm. And if you listen to the Elite on their own, you don't notice this so much. But after listening with the other headphones, the Meze headphones certainly feel a lot thicker and a lot more kind of heavy sound than is expected, but it makes it easier to listen to modern pop music with the Elites than say with the HD820, which doesn't, as I found, do modern pop music quite so well. I think the HD800 series strengths were always with things like classical and jazz, where they really could focus on delivering a great mid-range, and the slightly brighter sound wasn't so grating. But it still doesn't have quite the refined treble I feel of maybe some of the better planers, and especially electrostats, which kind of give the ultimate treble presentation. So it's a kind of mixed one with this. If you do like your acoustic music and you do want a pair of closed back headphones, these could be really good, because the nearest things you have are, say, Meze's Lyrics on one end and the Stealths on the other. There isn't a heck of a lot out there that's available in a closed back form other than that. And if comfort is a big issue, certainly they do end up very comfortable. But I do recommend they're the kind of headphones you really do need to try out to see if you get a seal and see if the amount of bass you get is the amount that you really want, because that seems to be the critical thing between a lot of these headphones, is how well the bass is delivered. And as they get to more refinement, you do lose a lot of that kind of bloomy bass that can make music very entertaining, like you get with, say, the Meze headphones, when you do have a setup that is very kind of tightly damped and carefully designed. It does take away somewhat from the kind of entertainment value of the sound, like some people feel, say, with the Chord Gear, which has the electronic equivalent of doing the same. By removing a lot of the distortions that you kind of get used to, you end up with a sound that kind of, some people prefer kind of warmer, more euphonic sound for preference. Lastly, in terms of driving, well, they drove out of anything that will drive a pair of high impedance headphones. You can actually buy portable gear that will drive them pretty well. Even some of the portable gear I've been reviewing recently, like Dongle DACs and the others, although of course you won't get as much bass, you won't get as much kind of soundstage and detail, because with higher impedance headphones you need a higher voltage swing rather than more actual power, and delivering a fast voltage swing, while it's not so much a total challenge for even portable gear these days, you won't get quite the same result that you do get with high-end gear. So they're not really something I would take around as a pair of portable headphones. They are still quite large. But overall, in summary, I think that Sennheiser really did do a fantastic job with them, considering the constraint of still using the HD800 headband. So I'd like to thank Sennheiser for lending me a pair of these. Also, of course, thank you to everyone who's been supporting me up to this time. If my videos have helped you out in any way, consider either becoming a patron or buying me a coffee, and I'll give you all the links to those in the description, how you can say thank you in that regard. I'd also like to thank Headamp for sponsoring this video today. They sell a lot of the gear you actually see in this video. The HD820, all these headphones you have sitting here, as well as the Cord, and of course the Headamp GSX Mini sitting behind me, as well as the GSX, both of which are fantastic amplifiers, which will be a good match with something like a HD820 if you do decide to buy an entire system from them. So as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you online.